So what happens when a law that's supposed to heal old wounds ends up ripping open brand new ones? Well, that's exactly what's at the center of this huge debate raging across India's university campuses right now. We're talking about new anti-discrimination rules. They were meant to protect students, but a lot of critics are calling them a black law. So what is really going on here? Let's break it all down.
Okay, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the new rules, I just want you to look at this number, 118.4%. Just let that sink in for a second.
So what is that number? Well, that's the jump, the increase in reported cases of caste-based discrimination on campuses, and it happened in just 5 years. Think about that. This isn't just some dry statistic, right? It points to a real crisis, and that is exactly why India's University Grants Commission, the UGC, decided, okay, the old way of doing things is clearly broken, we have to act.
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll dig into the crisis that really pushed for these new rules. Then, we'll unpack what the rules actually say. After that, we'll get into why so many people are calling them a black law, and we'll look at the big Supreme Court challenge that could honestly change everything. And finally, we'll get to the real core of this whole thing. Can we find a solution that's both fair and effective?
So you gotta ask, what could possibly push the UGC to make such a drastic change? Well, the answer isn't simple. It's really a story that involves a series of heartbreaking tragedies and a very clear, very direct order from India's Supreme Court.
You see, the tragic deaths of Rohit Vemla and Payal Tadvi, both students from marginalized communities who died by suicide, they really threw a national spotlight on this problem of campus discrimination. And their mothers, they just refused to be silent. They took their fight for justice all the way to the Supreme Court, basically saying, look, the rules you have now are failing our children. And you know what? The court agreed. In 2025, it looked at the UGC and gave them a very clear mandate. You have to create new rules, and they need to have real power. The clock was officially ticking.
And so, come January 2026, the UGC delivered. They rolled out these new regulations, officially called the Promotion of Equity in Higher Education Institutions Regulations. And let me be clear, this wasn't just some minor update. No, this was a complete overhaul of the entire system, and it was designed from the ground up to give these anti-discrimination efforts some real, actual teeth.
And you can really see the night and day difference right here. The old rules from 2012, they were mostly just suggestions. The new ones, they're mandatory, they're law. Before, figuring out who was responsible was like playing a game of hot potato. Now, it lands squarely on the desk of the head of the institution. And for the very first time, we're seeing strict deadlines and real consequences. I'm talking everything from cutting a university's funding to literally canceling its recognition.
So how are they going to enforce all this? Well, every single campus now has to set up this new 3-part system. First, there's an equal opportunity center for things like legal aid and support. Second, you've got a really powerful equity committee to investigate any complaints. And third, and this is a big one, mobile equity squads, whose job it is to patrol campus and proactively stop discrimination before it happens. Now, the really crucial part here is the makeup of that equity committee. It has to include members from marginalized communities, which means they finally have a direct voice in the whole process.
Okay, so you've got clearer rules, real accountability, actual consequences. On paper, this sounds like a huge step in the right direction, doesn't it? But the reality was completely different. These new regulations were met with an absolute firestorm of protest. So that brings us to the big question. Why on earth are so many critics calling this a black law?
And I think this quote right here really gets to the very heart of the backlash. The argument from critics is that in this big effort to protect marginalized students, the UGC has accidentally created a new marginalized group, an invisible, voiceless group made up of students from the general category.
So let's get specific. What are the main complaints here? Well, for starters, critics say the rules are totally one-sided, that they basically presume guilt. A huge point of contention is that a provision to penalize false complaints was actually in the draft, but it was removed from the final version. So the argument goes, it's now really easy to accuse someone, but incredibly hard to defend yourself. You combine that with the fact that there's no required representation for general category students on these new committees, and you throw in these equity squads patrolling campus, and well, you can see why critics are saying this whole setup is just a recipe for a brand new kind of discrimination.
And look, this wasn't just some argument happening online, not just a Twitter war. the backlash actually spilled out into the real world. We saw student protests, big online campaigns. It even led to some really high-profile resignations. We're talking about youth political leaders and even a city magistrate in Uttar Pradesh who quit their jobs, publicly calling these new regulations a black law.
So, naturally, the fight against these regulations has now moved from the campus grounds to the courtroom. The entire legal framework is being challenged in the Supreme Court, and believe it or not, the whole entire case might just hinge on the definition of a single word.
And here it is. This is the absolute core of the legal challenge. The law defines caste-based discrimination as something that happens only on the basis of caste against members of the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and other backward classes. That one little word, only. That's the whole ballgame. Because critics are arguing that this definition makes it legally impossible for a student from a general or so-called upper caste to ever be considered a victim of caste-based discrimination, no matter what was said or done to them.
So the petition that's now in front of the Supreme Court says, hey, wait a minute, this one-way street definition of discrimination just doesn't match up with reality. And to prove that point, they're pointing to very real examples of things like anti-Brahmin and anti-Banya graffiti and slogans that have popped up at major universities. They're using this as evidence that, hostility can absolutely flow in both directions. So the question they're putting to the court is pretty simple, really. If discrimination can be a two-way street, why does this law only protect traffic going in one direction?
So, as you can probably tell by now, this is so much more than just a legal fight over one word in a document. It's really a massive debate about a fundamental question. How do you heal the deep wounds of the past without accidentally creating new ones in the present? It's a question that really gets to the very heart of what it even means to build a just and equal society.
And this really is the central dilemma, isn't it? On one hand, the intent behind these rules is to fight a very real and, as we saw, a growing problem of discrimination. But on the other hand, critics are saying the design is flawed. They argue it creates what they call a hierarchy of victimhood, where the experiences of some students are legally valued more than others. So the massive challenge for India right now is figuring out how to protect the vulnerable without completely chilling campus speech or alienating huge groups of students, many of whom, by the way, are from non-privileged backgrounds themselves and are also just trying to get by.
One writer really summed it up perfectly. They asked, will we build systems that heal historical wounds without inflicting new ones? That right there is the massive challenge facing not just India's universities, but really the entire country.
So where does all of this leave us? I mean, these regulations were created with a clear goal, to bring justice to people who've been denied it for a very, very long time. But the intense backlash forces us to ask a really tough question. In the fight for a more just society, can we afford to be selective about who gets protection? Or does true justice, in the end, have to be blind?